The woman Taemin had divorced almost 6 years earlier had just walked into his engagement party. Not alone. Two small boys at her sides, dressed in matching navy suits, holding her hands like they'd done it 1,000 times before. The problem wasn't that she came. The problem was that the moment she stepped through those doors, every person in that ballroom looked at those two boys' faces and then looked at Taemin's, and nobody in the room needed to be told what they were looking at. Her name was Michelle Carter. And the moment she crossed that threshold, calm, straight-haired, dressed simply in deep wine, something shifted in the room that no one could explain and no one could stop. Please like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from, because what happens in the next 20 minutes inside that ballroom is the kind of thing people would still be talking about a year later. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to mouths. Heads turned, first toward Michelle, then down toward the two boys, then back up toward the man standing under the brightest light in the room, and stayed there. Young Taemin, 38 years old, heir to Biko Group, stood beside his fiancée with a glass of champagne lifted halfway through a toast nobody would remember finishing. Beside him, in champagne-colored silk, stood Hannah, one hand resting low against her stomach in the unconscious way women carry something they're proud of. 3 months along. The curve no longer something a careful dress could fully soften. Visible enough now, under the chandelier light, that nobody in that room could pretend not to notice it, any more than they could pretend not to notice the two small boys who had just walked in looking exactly like the groom-to-be. Hannah had spent 3 weeks planning this exact moment, and none of it had gone the way she designed it. She had mailed the invitation herself, sealed it herself, handed it to her assistant herself, with instructions specific enough that there could be no mistake about where it needed to land. She'd told herself it was generous, even gracious, inviting the woman she'd replaced to witness the life she'd built in her place. What she hadn't told herself, not even privately, was that humiliating a woman in front of the family that once rejected her was its own kind of trophy, one she intended to collect in front of 200 witnesses. She had worked hard for this evening, genuinely hard. Not the effortless kind of hard wealthy women pretend to, but the real kind. The kind that lives in seating charts and vendor calls and weeks of details managed without ever appearing to manage them. She had believed, until about 4 minutes ago, that the evening was going to be perfect. She had never set out to destroy Michelle. She hadn't thought she'd needed to. By the time Hannah entered Taemin's life, his first marriage was already over, ended quietly under the weight of his mother's suspicion and his own unwillingness to ask a single direct question. Hannah had simply been available when something became available. She told herself that was different from causing harm. Most days, she still believed it. But watching the room reorganize itself now, watching investors find reasons to drift toward Michelle, watching Taemin's eyes track two children he hadn't known an hour ago, like nothing else in the room existed, Hannah felt the first cold edge of a question she hadn't prepared for. What if winning someone wasn't the same as being chosen by them? She had not expected the doors to open on the wrong woman entirely. She had pictured Michelle arriving uncertain, overdressed or underdressed, standing awkwardly near the entrance until someone took pity on her. She had not pictured a woman walking in like she had nowhere else in the world she needed to be, with two children who silenced an entire ballroom before she'd said a single word. Madame Choi, seated near the head table, had gone very still. She was looking at the two boys with an expression that hadn't crossed her face in years, something closer to fear than anything she usually allowed herself to feel in public. She had spent nearly 6 years certain the story she'd built was airtight. She was watching that certainty come apart in real time, in front of the exact people whose opinions she had spent her entire life curating. If you've ever watched a lie collapse in front of 200 witnesses, stay with me, because this story is just getting started, and you do not want to look away from what happens next. 3 weeks earlier, in a one-bedroom apartment in Atlanta, Michelle had sat at her kitchen table, holding a gold-lettered invitation that had been hand-delivered by a courier who'd flown an unreasonable distance to put it directly into her assistant's hands. She'd turned it over twice before opening it, already certain of what it was and who had sent it, and she'd sat with it for 3 full days before she let herself answer the only question that actually mattered. It wasn't whether she wanted to go. She knew immediately she didn't. It was whether her sons deserved a mother who kept making that decision for them. June and Jihu had started asking about their father almost a year earlier. It began at a classmate's birthday party, where another boy's father had shown up straight from work and scooped his son onto his shoulders in the driveway. And Jihu had watched the exchange with an attention Michelle recognized instantly, because she'd been quietly dreading it for years. "Where's our dad?" he'd asked her in the car on the way home. Not upset, just curious, the way 5-year-olds ask most things, like the answer might be simple if she just gave it to him. For months, she'd given them careful, incomplete answers. He lived far away. It was complicated. True, as far as it went, but not the kind of true that satisfies a child for very long. The questions only sharpened. June asked once, while she was cooking, whether his father knew they existed at all. Jihu came home from soccer practice one Saturday and asked, in the flat, rehearsed tone children use when they've been turning a question over privately, whether his father was tall. There was a Father's Day craft table at school that Michelle hadn't braced herself for, where June made a card for a father he'd never met and tucked it into his desk drawer without a word, folded into a small, deliberate square she found 3 days later by accident. That card was what finally moved her. For months before the invitation ever arrived, Michelle sat both boys down on the living room couch and told them his name. She showed them a photograph, an old one, the only one she'd kept, his arm around her on a street in Seoul neither of them remembered. She told them the truth as fairly as she knew how to tell it. Their father hadn't known about them. He hadn't walked away from them on purpose, because he never got the chance to choose to stay. What she didn't tell them, because it didn't seem like something 2 5-year-olds needed to carry, was the part she still hadn't fully made peace with herself. She had suspected, in the last days of her marriage, before she ever signed anything, that something had changed in her body. She hadn't said it out loud to anyone, not even to the doctor who could have confirmed it in an afternoon. She left the marriage carrying a guess she wasn't ready to test, because testing it would have meant deciding, right then, in the middle of the worst week of her life, what she was willing to do with the answer. The confirmation came days after she landed in Atlanta, alone, in a clinic she'd booked out of exhaustion more than certainty. 2 heartbeats where she'd braced herself for nothing more than an explanation of why she felt so unwell. She had walked out of her marriage already halfway to knowing. She had simply refused to let herself fully know it until there was no one left whose reaction she had to manage but her own. She told her sons that mattered, that there was a difference between a man who leaves and a man who was never told. She believed it when she said it. She still believed it, mostly, even now. What she'd never said to anyone, not even to herself in those exact words, was that some nights she wondered whether she would have stayed those last few days, said something, asked one more question of her own, if she'd let herself be certain instead of merely afraid. June had studied the photograph for a long time that day, the particular careful attention he brings to everything, and asked only one question. Is he going to come find us? I don't know, baby, she told him. Maybe one day. She hadn't expected one day to arrive wrapped in gold lettering, addressed correctly, 3 months later. She decided, sitting at that kitchen table with the invitation in her hands, that she wasn't going to that party to humiliate anyone, and she wasn't going because some old wound in her needed an audience after almost 6 years of silence. She was going because 2 little boys who now knew their father's name and his face had started asking, more and more, whether he was ever going to come looking for them himself, and she had decided that if he wasn't going to find them, she would stop waiting on him to be brave enough to try. She told them only that they were going to a party where they might meet someone important. She didn't tell them it was him. She wanted to watch his face when he understood, and she wanted to see, without warning softening it for either of them, exactly what her sons would do with a face they already knew, standing in front of them for the first time. Back in the ballroom, Taemin hadn't moved. He was looking at the 2 boys the way a man looks at something he spent 6 years insisting couldn't possibly exist, even as it stands directly in front of him, proving otherwise. Recognition arrived on his face in stages, like weather moving across it. Confusion first, then something close to fear, then, last and slowest, something he had told himself for years not to hope for at all. What nobody in that ballroom knew, including Michelle, was that Taemin's 6 years hadn't been entirely passive, though they had nearly all been failures. 18 months after the divorce, in a low moment he never told anyone about, He had hired a private investigator to find her, not to win her back, he told himself, only to know she was all right. The investigator came back 3 weeks later with an address in Atlanta that was already 6 months out of date, a phone number disconnected, and a name change on a business filing that didn't immediately connect back to anyone he recognized. Taemin had stared at that incomplete file for a long time. Then he had done something he never told anyone either. He flew to Atlanta himself, alone, on a weekend his assistant believed he'd spent at a conference in Osaka, and stood across the street from the address in the file for the better part of an afternoon, watching a door that never opened, working up the nerve to knock on it. He never did. He told himself it was respect for her privacy. It was also, if he was honest with himself, fear of what he might learn if he kept looking, and the particular cowardice of a man who would rather carry an unanswered question forever than risk hearing the answer be no. He flew home the next morning and never tried again. "Mommy, why is that man staring at us?" June asked, tugging her hand. "Give it a minute, baby," Michelle said, and kept walking. She hadn't taken 10 more steps before a voice stopped her, sharp with recognition, cutting cleanly through the murmur of the room. It belonged to a silver-haired woman near the center table, the wife of one of the evening's largest donors, who had stood up from her seat so quickly her napkin slid to the floor unnoticed. "You're the woman from the Bloomberg piece," she said, not quite to Michelle, more to the room at large, like she needed witnesses to confirm she wasn't imagining it. "Humbiliate Capital. I sat on a panel with your CFO in Singapore last spring. He talked about you for 20 minutes, and I assumed, given how he described the company, that you were going to be twice his age." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're the reason 3 of my husband's portfolio companies stopped losing their best female hires to competitors. He's been trying to get a meeting with your office for a year." The room's attention, which had been entirely fixed on 2 small boys and the man they resembled, split now into something more complicated. It wasn't only about who had fathered the children standing at the entrance. It was about who, exactly, this woman had quietly become in the years nobody in that room had bothered to keep track of. Nobody in that ballroom knew what Michelle had built with the years they assumed had simply diminished her. While Taemin had been standing across a street he never crossed, Michelle had been in a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 newborns and a business plan, taking pitch meetings standing in a grocery store parking lot, because daycare pickup was in 20 minutes. 9 investors told her no. The 10th didn't care that she was raising twins alone, only that the numbers in front of him were impossible to argue with. And he wrote the first real check Humbiliate Capital ever received. By the time her son started kindergarten, that check had grown into something that had funded over 3,000 women-owned businesses across the Southeast, women who'd been told no everywhere else, the same way Michelle had once been told, secondhand, through a husband who never thought to ask her directly, that her own body had failed at the one thing his family valued. None of that had been built for this room, but the room had found it anyway, the way truth tends to find its way into rooms that have spent years organized around a lie. It was a man near the bar who said it first, quiet, almost to himself. "Look at the jaw on that one." Then louder, to the woman beside him. "Tell me that's a coincidence." The room looked. The room could not tell him it was. Whispers moved through the crowd like static, building before anyone fully understood what they were building toward. An older man near the dessert table set his drink down entirely, both hands suddenly free, as if he needed them for balance while his understanding of the evening rearranged itself. Madame Choi's champagne glass had gone still in her hand, her knuckles pale around the stem. Taemin crossed the room before his mother could stop him, though she didn't try very hard. He lowered himself slowly to the boy's level, his knee meeting marble, his hands visibly trembling. "What are your names?" His voice came out smaller than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "June," said the older one. He didn't smile. He studied Taemin's face for a long moment first, the way a person studies a photograph they've memorized to see if the real thing matches. "You're him. From the picture." Taemin went very still. "You knew?" "Mommy showed us a long time ago," Jihu said, stepping slightly in front of his brother, the way he does when something feels like it needs defending. "She said you didn't know about us. She said that's why you weren't there." "That's right," Taemin said, his voice cracking somewhere in the middle of the second word. "I didn't know. I would have." "Then why didn't you come find us?" June said. Not loudly. Not even angrily, exactly. just flat and direct, the same way he'd asked Michelle the question 4 months earlier. Except this time the person who had to answer it was the one the question had always actually been about. If you wanted to know us, why didn't you ever come looking? Taemin opened his mouth, and nothing came out for a long moment. Somewhere behind him, he was aware of 200 people not breathing. He thought, helplessly, of a street in Atlanta and a door he never knocked on, and understood that whatever answer he gave this 5-year-old was going to have to be truer than the one he'd given himself for the last 4 years. I tried once, he said quietly. Not hard enough. I got close enough to find where you might be, and I was too afraid to find out for certain. That's not an excuse. It's just true, and I think you deserve true more than you deserve an excuse. Do you love us? Jihu asked, 5 years old, standing in a hotel ballroom in a suit too formal for him, asking the only question that had ever actually mattered underneath all the others. You don't even know us. How can you love us if you don't know us? It was the question that broke him, more than the room, more than his mother's stricken face, more than anything Hannah would do in the next 10 minutes. Taemin, who ran a company that controlled the income of 11,000 employees, who had not cried in front of another person since he was younger than the boy standing in front of him asking him this, felt his eyes go hot and didn't try to stop it. I don't know you yet, he said. That's true, but I think I already do, a little. I've thought about you since the second I saw your faces, even before I knew your names. I know that's not the same as loving someone the way you deserve to be loved. I know I have to earn that the same way I'd have to earn anything else I actually want. But I want the chance. More than I've wanted almost anything in my life. If you'll let me have it. June studied him for another long moment, weighing this the way he weighs most things, and said nothing. It wasn't forgiveness. Michelle, watching from a few feet away, understood that her son wasn't going to hand that over easily, and some part of her, the part that had spent 6 years protecting them alone, was fiercely, quietly proud of him for it. Hannah's voice cut through whatever moment that was building, too loud, too fast, the careful composure she'd built for this exact evening cracking down the middle. This is absurd. She walks in uninvited with 2 children, and the entire room forgets why we're here? Taemin. He didn't look at her. He was still looking at his sons, and at the woman who'd raised them without him, like he was trying to memorize something he'd almost let himself believe didn't exist. Madame Choi's voice, when it came, was smaller than anyone remembered it ever being. The doctor's report, she started. It said, whatever it said, Michelle told her, turning to face her former mother-in-law directly for the first time in nearly 6 years. You made sure I never saw it myself, didn't you? You handed your son a result, and let him build years of grief on top of a piece of paper I was never once allowed to question. Her voice stayed level, because she'd promised herself in a lawyer's office almost 6 years earlier that if this moment ever came, she would not give this woman the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Ask yourself, honestly, in front of everyone here if you have to, whether that report exists the way you've always described it. Madame Choi didn't answer. The silence answered for her. The way silence always eventually does for the things people spend years refusing to say out loud. Years earlier, Madame Choi had decided, somewhere in Michelle's first year of marriage into the family, that the American woman her son had chosen was a problem to be solved rather than a daughter to be welcomed, and she had spent the following years solving her with the patience of a woman who never once doubted she'd eventually win. It started with comments at dinner, other families' grandchildren mentioned a little too often to be accidental. Then a doctor she'd recommended herself, whose results Michelle was told about secondhand, through Taemin, rather than shown directly, because that was simply how things were done in families like theirs. Then, when the air pressure alone hadn't moved fast enough, a folder of photographs, Michelle laughing in a car with her visiting cousin, his hand briefly on her shoulder, her head tilted back mid-laugh at some joke nobody outside that car would ever remember. Cropped, arranged, handed to Taemin with enough confidence that he never once thought to call Michelle and ask her himself. It was somewhere inside that silence that Hannah's phone rang, sharp and insistent inside her clutch, at exactly the wrong second for her composure to survive it. Something crossed her face before she could stop it, faster than fear, closer to dread. The particular look of a woman who has been waiting for one specific call to never come and has just watched it arrive anyway. She excused herself too quickly, one hand pressed low against the small, undeniable curve beneath her dress, stepping toward the hallway with the particular urgency of someone who needed privacy more than she needed to be polite about asking for it. Taemin watched her go, something in his face shifting between suspicion and a question he hadn't let himself ask out loud yet. But he didn't follow her right away. He stayed kneeling in front of his sons a little longer, not asking them easy questions this time, just staying, letting them look at him as long as they needed to, letting the silence between them be whatever it needed to be instead of rushing to fill it. A waiter eventually steered all three of them toward the dessert table, more out of habit than instruction, and Michelle watched from a few feet away as Taemin stood beside a tray of pastries, not performing warmth, just present, while June explained, eventually, almost despite himself, the rules of a card game he'd invented that had no consistent rules at all. Jihu interrupted to disagree about details June had apparently changed since the last telling. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something smaller and more fragile than that. Two boys deciding, in real time, whether the man in front of them was worth the risk of being curious about. It was a few minutes later, once the boys had settled at the dessert table under a waiter's watchful eye, that Taemin finally excused himself to follow Hannah into the hallway. She was standing near the service entrance when he found her, phone pressed to her ear, her back half turned. He stayed just out of her sight line, close enough to hear every word. "I told you not to call me tonight," she was saying, low and urgent. "I told you this is not the time." A pause. "Dong Hyun, I don't care what you want, you cannot show up here." Taemin didn't make a sound. He stood there in the hallway and let the first piece of the last 3 months rebuild itself into something true. 3 months earlier, at a dinner hosted by his mother, his drink had been altered. Neither he nor Madame Choi fully understood, even afterward, the precise mechanics of what had been used or how deliberate it had been. Only that Madame Choi had arranged it herself, certain she was simply removing her son's hesitation about a marriage she'd spent years engineering. She told herself a gentler story, the way people who do unforgivable things always find one. What she hadn't accounted for was what happened upstairs, in a private room, while her son sat fighting to stay conscious. The only thing he remembered clearly from that night was saying a name into the dark, more than once, like an apology aimed at someone who wasn't there. Michelle's. He stood in that hallway and let that single fact settle into him fully before he let himself think about anything else. He had been drugged in his own mother's house. He had spent 3 months believing he'd done something unforgivable to a woman he barely remembered touching, when the truth, the whole time, was simpler and worse. He hadn't betrayed anyone. He had been used. It took him another moment to notice that Hannah was still talking. "It doesn't matter whose it is," she said now, her voice dropping into something pleading. "As far as everyone here is concerned, it's his. That's how this works. That's how it's always going to work." That sentence rearranged the rest of it. Hannah had stood in that doorway 3 months earlier and heard him say another woman's name, twice, while he could barely hold his own head up. Whatever plan she'd built around that evening unraveled in the space of one murmured word, and something in her had decided, right there, that if he wanted to keep reaching for a memory of a woman who'd been gone for nearly 6 years, she would simply build something he couldn't argue his way out of. Within days, she'd met a man named Dong Hyun for dinner, deliberately, and what happened between them that night had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with leverage. Weeks after that, she'd stood in front of her own mirror holding a sonogram, rehearsing the most important lie of her life, the same lie that had just come apart in a hotel hallway the moment Dong Hyun made the mistake of calling her in the middle of the one night she most needed him silent. The baby wasn't his. It had never been his. And his mother, the woman who'd engineered this entire engagement believing she was finally giving her son the family she decided Michelle couldn't, had no idea any of it was built on a lie inside a lie. He walked back into that ballroom a different man than the one who'd walked out of it. Hannah returned a minute behind him, her composure rebuilt, reaching for his arm with the practiced smile she'd worn all evening. He didn't take it. "Dong Hyun," he said, quietly enough that only the people closest to them could hear, which in a room like that was more than enough. "Is that the name of the man whose child you're carrying?" Every conversation within 20 feet of them stopped. Hannah's face moved through 3 expressions before she found a fourth, the false one, the one she'd practiced for emergencies. I don't know what you're talking about. I heard you, Taemin said. In the hallway. Just now. Every word. The performance dropped entirely. For one unguarded second, before she rebuilt anything, something genuine crossed Hannah's face, something that looked almost like relief, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been performing a lie for 3 straight months and has just been told, against everything she wanted, that she doesn't have to anymore. It didn't last. It couldn't. Not in that room. Not with 200 people watching. But Michelle saw it, and some small, complicated part of her almost felt sorry for the woman across the room. Almost, before she remembered exactly what that lie had been built to cost her and her sons. Whatever was left of Hannah's careful architecture came down in front of 200 witnesses, all at once, with nowhere left to hide it. A woman near the front, who had been quietly recording on her phone for several minutes without anyone noticing, lowered it slowly, the footage already capturing everything that mattered. The first visible casualty arrived within the hour, not the next morning. The fashion house that had dressed Hannah for the engagement, the same house whose creative director was a guest at the party, sent a single text message to her phone that she made the mistake of reading in front of 3 other women near the coat check. We will not be able to honor the closing gown for the spring showcase. We wish you well. She read it twice, her face going through the same collapse the rest of her composure had gone through 10 minutes earlier, and one of the women standing near her, not unkindly, just honestly, said, "I think that's the last one tonight, sweetheart," and walked away without waiting for a response. By the time Hannah reached her car, alone, no one offering to walk her out, 2 of the women she'd called her closest friends for the better part of a decade had already left the building without saying goodbye. She sat in the back seat for 11 minutes before she could make herself tell the driver to go, her phone lighting up over and over with messages she didn't open, and somewhere in those 11 minutes, hand resting on the small curve she'd built an entire engagement around, she understood with total clarity that she had just spent 3 months destroying a marriage that was never actually hers to take, for a child that was never actually his, and that there was no version of the next morning that gave any of it back. By morning, the rest followed in pieces, the way these things always do. 2 charity boards she'd sat on for the optics removed her name from their websites within 48 hours, no explanation offered because none was needed. She did not simply lose her engagement. She lost every invitation, every table reservation, every door her careful performance had spent a decade prying open, and there was no folder of edited photographs this time to rebuild the story in her favor. Madame Choi said nothing else that night. She left early, alone, her face the color of someone watching every plan she'd ever built collapse in 20 minutes, undone not by an enemy, but by her own son's drug confession and her own daughter-in-law's greed. Michelle didn't stay to watch the rest of it unfold. She had 2 boys who'd had an enormous night, bigger than either of them fully understood yet, and they needed sleep more than they needed to witness an empire collapsing in real time. She gathered them, thanked the woman who'd recognized her with a graciousness that cost her nothing because she meant every word of it, and left before the worst of the chaos finished arriving. Taemin followed her out to the front of the hotel, into the cold, where her car was already waiting, hands in his pockets, looking like a man trying to figure out how to ask for something he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to ask for. "I want to know them," he said, glancing toward the back seat where June and Jihu were already half asleep, buckled in, the lit-up shoes finally still. "I want to know you. I know I don't get to ask for that the way I would have 6 years ago. I know I have to earn it. I'm ready to. I'm not going to keep them from you," Michelle told him, and she meant it completely. "They've been asking about you for almost a year now. They deserve a father who actually shows up, not just one who exists somewhere far away in a story I tell them. If you're serious, you'll have to prove it the slow way. Not this week. Not this month. I'm talking about a year from now, still showing up, on the ordinary days nobody's filming. No shortcuts, and no promises I'm going to take at face value just because tonight was hard for you too. I understand. But I need you to hear the second part just as clearly," she said. "I didn't come back for you. I came back because 2 little boys needed an answer I'd been too afraid to give them. You can be their father. That's not the same as being anything to me." He nodded, and for once he didn't argue with a verdict, just let it stand the way it needed to. 3 days later, Taemin's phone rang at close to midnight. his mother's name on the screen. He almost let it go to voicemail. When he answered, the voice on the other end was barely recognizable, cracked in places he had never once heard crack in 38 years of knowing her. "I was wrong," Madame Choi said into the phone, and then nothing for a long moment, just the sound of a woman finally arriving somewhere she'd spent years avoiding. "I built a lie because I was afraid of losing my son to a life I didn't choose for him, and I told myself it was protection. It wasn't. I don't know how to undo what I did. I don't know if there's any undoing it. I only know I needed you to hear me say I'm sorry." Taemin asked her, quietly, whether she'd called Michelle directly to say the same thing. There was a long pause on the line. "I didn't think she'd take my call," Madame Choi admitted. "She might not," Taemin said. "You should still try. Not because it fixes anything. Because she's earned the choice of whether to listen, and you took that choice away from her once already." Madame Choi did call, 2 days after that, and Michelle did pick up, mostly out of curiosity about whether the woman would actually go through with it. She listened to the apology in full. When it was over, she was quiet for long enough that Madame Choi asked, in a small voice, whether she was still there. "I'm here," Michelle said. "Thank you for calling. I don't know what to do with it yet, if I'm honest. You took 5 years from 2 little boys who didn't do anything to deserve losing them, and an apology, even a real one, doesn't hand those years back. I'm not going to pretend it does just to make this phone call easier for either of us. But I heard you. That's what I can give you tonight. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a door closing either. It was simply true, the way Michelle had decided years ago that true mattered more than easy, even when easy was right there for the taking." Taemin texted the following morning, careful and a little formal, the way people write when they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, asking if Saturday might work for a visit, if Michelle would allow it, if the boys were ready. She looked at the message for a long time, standing in her kitchen while June and Jihu argued cheerfully over a cartoon in the next room. The same way they had every morning for 6 years, just the 3 of them, steady and whole in a way she'd built with her own 2 hands. She typed back 2 words. Saturday works. What that Saturday would actually look like, neither of them knew yet. Whether years of silence could ever fully close, whether a man who'd stood across a street and never knocked could become the father 2 boys had spent a year quietly hoping for, whether "I want the chance" was something Taemin could actually sustain once the cameras and the chandeliers and the audience of 200 were gone, and it was just him, alone, showing up on an ordinary Tuesday with nothing to prove and no one watching. Michelle didn't know. She wasn't sure he knew either. She had learned, over 6 years of building a life with no one watching at all, that the only proof that ever really counts is the kind nobody claps for. She set the phone down, walked into the living room, and sat between her sons on the couch, one arm around each of them, exactly the way she had every single day since the night she drove home from a clinic parking lot and decided, alone, that she would build them a life worth being curious about, no matter who eventually showed up to be part of it. If you'd been standing where Michelle stood in that ballroom doorway, knowing everything she knew, would you have walked through those doors at all? Would you have let your sons ask him those questions, or tried to shield them from a moment that hard? Knowing she suspected she was pregnant before she even left, do you think she should have said something before walking away, or was she right to wait until she was certain? And if Taemin shows up Saturday, ready or not, do you think years of silence can actually be undone, or is some damage simply permanent no matter how sorry everyone ends up being? Tell me what you would have done in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. And if this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe, because there's another one waiting.